In the book, that's the thing. I provide citations to all the science so you can read it and make up your own mind. And if people are telling you something to the contrary, you can say, well, go look at this science. All the citations, all the studies I talk about are in the book as a resource. And so people can use those studies and use the end of gender as a way of saying, when someone says to you something ridiculous like gender's a spectrum, that you can point to this and say, well, actually, here are the studies showing otherwise.
I've decided to read Debra Soh's book, The End of Gender. I'm going to enjoy critiquing the fuck out of this. Well, that will teach me to open my fucking mouth because after 2 months of reading Deborah's book, listening to her interviews, and trying to drum up any information I can on her, I deeply regret this decision.
But you can't even have that conversation now because
Right, you
that's considered
can't.
transphobic.
Right.
What it is homophobic, though, that you can't consider that some of these kids just might be gay children.
But here's Debra Soh. Armed with a PhD in sex and neuroscience from York University, she's published a book to take a stronger stand in the battle against biology, to take aim at everyone who blocked her on Twitter. Now, after 5 years of study, of following transgender issues, of getting blowback for her opinions, you'd think that Deborah would have amassed an overwhelming amount of evidence for her current positions, and that she could easily disassemble any counterargument brought against her. Deborah is, after all, a neuroscientist, and she has scientific data to back up everything she's saying.
My PhD is in sexual neuroscience research. I'm a neuroscientist who specializes in human sexuality because these people have no idea what the scientific method entails. They probably don't even know anything about the scientific research. Please don't go based on what people say. Sometimes some people will try to take clips out of it and say she said something
Right,
that I
exactly.
didn't read into the next paragraph.
Wait,
I say
no,
very
no,
clearly
take that
that
part
that's
out,
not
take
what
it
I'm.
out. But if you read her book, The End of Gender, you realize that Deborah's arguments haven't grown in sophistication or depth beyond vague concern trolling and conservative value baiting. The sources she brings and the arguments she makes don't hold up to a critical eye. Over the course of the next few videos, I want to take a closer look at The End of Gender, and I am hopefully going to explain why I think Debra Soh is so wrong. Before we get started, I want to thank you for clicking on the video. Please feel free to leave a comment expressing your agreement or disagreement with Deborah's points, as it'd be interesting to see where people fall. As I mentioned, I'm going to divide my criticisms of Deborah and her book across a few videos. The End of Gender is divided into 3 main sections, with each section composed of 3 general themes. So I'm going to stick to 1 section per video, and hopefully that will keep things from feeling too bloated. The first section of the book is titled The Foundation, and largely revolves around sex, gender, and neuroscience. Deborah lays out 3 myths she plans to disprove in each of the chapters. However, although it's not stated outright, Deborah is also pushing a specific position in each of these chapters. It's not just that biological sex isn't a spectrum, but it's also binary. Gender is not a social construct, it's also biological. You get the idea. Once you frame the myths contrasted to Deborah's actual arguments, you can already see the issues with Deborah's position starting to form. One of the major issues that presents itself in the very first chapter is in how Deborah defines sex. Now, most scientific and medical organizations use a genetic view of sex determination in humans. If your chromosomes are XX, you're a female, and if you're XY, you're male. More broadly, sex refers to physical and physiological characteristics of individuals. Deborah instead defines sex based on the types of gametes an individual has: male if you have sperm, female if you have eggs. Since there are no intermediate gametes, to Deborah, there are only 2 sexes. Now, one could point out, given that some people are born infertile or postmenopausal women exist that don't have eggs, that such an overly reductive definition of sex necessarily excludes those individuals as not male or female. Even extending it to what you produce.
What is gender? What's the difference between sex and gender? Number one.
So, biological sex is determined by gametes. So, these are mature reproductive cells. So, you produce sperm or you produce eggs.
Boys don't produce sperm until puberty, and again, there are people that are born infertile who may not produce any gametes. So, following this definition to its logical conclusion, using gametes as sex would still leave you with at least 3 different groups, not the sex binary that Deborah's pushing forward. Deborah's only response to this argument is to say that people who would make it are being absurd, while choosing to ignore that it's her overly reductive definitions that lead to this issue. Even other theorists have noted that accepting biological sex as binary in this way, you can't apply this definition universally to how we discuss sex in humans, as it's dealing strictly with an aspect of reproduction and not, everything else we're talking about in regards to sex. The reason for Deborah defining sex in this way, however, is because, although she won't say it outright, Deborah is a gender essentialist. Essentialism holds that entities have something core or foundational to them, an essence that is innate and immutable. Deborah believes that there is an essential binary to human sex, and so the definition she chooses to define sex must reflect that. She can't follow the general medical and scientific usage of sexual chromosomes because someone can rightfully point out that not everyone is born XX or XY, that there are variations on that, a little spectrum, if you will, that upend the idea that sex is a simple binary. But actually, according to Deborah, if you were to bring up this variation in chromosomal configurations, if you point out that intersex people exist, then you're actually just tokenizing them for your radical attack on biology. Never mind that Deborah is going to tokenize and speak for intersex individuals for several chapters while simultaneously ignoring the Intersex Society of North America's view that sex is a spectrum and not binary. And I know that Deborah saw this because she cites the ISNA's view on gender abolition in Chapter 3. Deborah tries to twist the existence of intersex individuals to fit a binary by stating that intersex people don't produce both gametes, so this proves sex is binary, ignoring again the obvious issues with that reductive argument. But then she makes the argument that just because there are intersex people doesn't mean we should redefine sex categories. So we've switched from what Deborah originally paints as a purely scientific argument.
The information that is being purported to be scientifically accurate, the information that's actually being supported by some scientific organizations, medical organizations, even governmental policies, are not actually fact-based.
To what this is really about for her, a prescriptive belief of what the whole of society should do based on her presuppositions about reality. Deborah's base argument is that since intersex individuals are only 1% of the population, it doesn't make sense statistically to add new sex categories. She brings up a counter argument she's heard that people with red hair or green eyes are also rare, but say these are not as rare as being intersex, despite showing the percentages in the book that these rates are in fact comparable. But she never actually deals with the counterpoint that even though having red hair or green eyes is rare, we don't then say that those individuals have brown hair or brown eyes. Who cares if it's only 1% of the population? It's still a lot of people, and we don't need to sweep them under the rug in service to the binary. Biology is highly variable, expressed along continua, and it's okay to replace rigid taxonomies if other approaches can capture more variance. Again, there's very little to back up Deborah's position in the first chapter that she doesn't immediately argue against and disprove, in her own book nonetheless. I want to be clear, this is her book to make her best arguments, and even when she has the opportunity, she still doesn't have any good comebacks to arguments against her claims.
お前はもう死んでいる。何？
But again, part of this is because Deborah isn't coming to a conclusion based on science. She's starting from a specific philosophical position and bending scientific findings to fit the necessary conclusions of her philosophy. Throughout the first chapter, you see Deborah equivocating biological as a description of physiological processes, with biological as intrinsic qualities of an organism. This equivocation is done somewhat deliberately because it facilitates the essentialist view. And the twisting of science to make these essentialist points in this first section is most seen in Chapter 2. Deborah's second chapter attempts to dismiss the idea that gender is a social construct, and instead show that it's biological. But Deborah is already demonstrating she's misusing these two terms, and she's actually done this over and over in the past several years.
So gender, when people say gender is a social construct, it means that gender roles are imposed by society. So people learn their gender, they're socialized to be masculine or feminine.
While I've mentioned that Deborah is using biological to mean an intrinsic immutable quality, Deborah is also misusing social construct to mean purely socialized or environmental. In reality, social construction and biological are not mutually exclusive. Emotions are social constructs. Even though there are neurophysiological pathways that have been well characterized over the last half century, pinpointing how organisms generate fearful responses to stimuli and why, we as scientists recognize that the meaning we ascribe to these are in fact constructed. Even if we did mean a social construct as an environmental effect anyway, all things in biology involve the environment. These are not dichotomous views of any concept. The evidence that Deborah tries to present that gender is biological, however, is incredibly weak and doesn't actually end up supporting the conclusions that she comes to. There are a few famous papers on sex differences in the brain that I knew Deborah was going to have to deal with to make her points, but I honestly did not expect her to deal with them in such a sloppy and easily debunkable manner. One of the major papers Deborah notes is Sex Beyond Genitalia, the Human Brain Mosaic by Daphne Joel and colleagues, originally published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences back in 2015. Joel and the team looked at the gray matter of brains from men and women across a variety of data sets. Instead of simply comparing men and women as discrete groups, the team reconstructed distributions of the variability on a brain region by brain region basis, constructing continua of maleness to femaleness. When you approach the data this way, really looking at the variability in each brain region instead of collapsing upon it, you find that there's not a single male or female brain, but that individuals display a mosaic pattern, with each person showing different regions that are more male or more female. As anyone who's done brain imaging might expect, the brain is highly varied, and there are not clearly sexed brains. There's no male brain and then a separate female brain. Because Debra needs this paper to be ignored and misconstrued as debunked nonsense, she states that the paper was categorically refuted 4 separate times. This is not true. Joel and colleagues received 4 replies, each critiquing the methodology and results, with a couple papers showing that if you do collapse across the variability, you can achieve high accuracy for classifying individual brains as belonging to a man or a woman. However, Joel and their team responded to each of these critiques in full. They laid out why the responses do not contradict the results, specifically noting that these replies, just like Deborah's critiques, are making specific assumptions that Joel and colleagues' analyses did not, even cheekily noting, which Deborah leaves out of her glowing review of the Delguidis reply, that many of the replies actually validated their initial results. The point which escaped Deborah and the authors of some of the responses they got is that to make an argument that there exists a male brain and a female brain, you need to show that there are in fact specific consistent differences between these individuals. But the fact remains, you don't see these sex differences. Everyone's brain is entirely different, and while there can certainly be averages and interesting within group variability, at the individual level, there is no such thing as a sex brain. It's interesting that Deborah focused on the Del Guadis reply in the book, though, considering the Turan reply would have been a better attempt at refuting Joel.
They claim to find one thing, but their methods, the flaws in the methods, and in one case, my colleagues actually reanalyzed the exact same brain data and found that they could find sex differences, even though the original study claimed that there were no sex differences. I thought it was interesting because you interviewed Michael Bailey in your book. So Mike Bailey is a former colleague and a friend of mine, and
This won't be the last example of Deborah the journalist paying special attention to her friend's work in the book. Deborah then moves on to other studies that have shown that sex differences in specific subcortical brain regions, such as the amygdala and hippocampus, are properly accounted for once you correct for appropriate covariance, such as differences in head size. Deborah counters with a study by Stuart Ritchie and colleagues that found significant sex differences in brain gray and white matter, and noting that they still found something within the amygdala. I like Ritchie's paper, but what Deborah is deliberately leaving out is that Ritchie and colleagues show large sex differences until you account for differences in intracranial volume, in which case these effect sizes, such as those within the amygdala, shrink dramatically. Ritchie and colleagues even note that, like prior studies, they didn't observe hippocampus differences. Even in the case of subcortical volumes, you can see the high degree of overlap between men and women in the sample. But another thing that Deborah leaves out from this paper, despite saying later that function is important, is that Ritchie and colleagues did not find strong sex differences in neurocognitive performance, and relatedly, their analyses linking sex differences in their brain measures to sex differences in behavior were also weak. So the same study that Deborah brings in to make her point actively disputes it. Now, Deborah does have a criticism that we don't know that a brain region size is correlated with their head or body size. But in actuality, we've known that body size correlates with head size and head size correlates with brain region size for years. It's why the standard recommendation for looking at brain region volumes is to somehow account for differences in intracranial volume. And Deborah must know this because she has done just this in her own published work analyzing gray matter volume. So I'm not sure why Deborah is levying this criticism on work that suggests there aren't really 2 types of brains, but it does really look like Deborah is just trying to ignore science and push forward her own poorly supported views. Deborah introduces several other studies on brain structure and function that compare averages between men and women. The criticisms of this approach, however, are the exact same as for the other examples, in that average differences don't demonstrate that these differences are essential, nor do they demonstrate that brains are specifically sexed. And even as Ritchie noted in the paper, you can observe differences in brain function or structure that are not necessarily tied to differences in behavior, even within the amygdala, which Deborah continually uses as an example. Likewise, as we see in many psychiatric disorders, you can have different behaviors and different phenotypes with very similar fMRI signal responses. Once again, these averages, while interesting, do not immediately demonstrate that something exists as an essential kind. Deborah is right to note we need to be careful in fMRI research because hormone cycles can affect brain findings, and that's true. But so can caffeine, stress, and everything else because it's the fucking brain. This doesn't prove that we're ignoring relevant sex or gender differences or that we'll stop caring about women in research. In fact, it's been the exact opposite over the last decade, where fully appreciating the spectrum of gender has led to more research involving women and female animals to untangle sex related effects. You might be starting to see why Deborah gets accused of cherry picking research findings, especially when she has to strawman her colleagues as blank slatists who say there are no sex differences, rely on counterfactuals, and make weird distinctions between neuroplasticity, which is a biological process, so you'd think it falls in the biology category, and a nebulous claim of biological influence, a distinction which solidifies that Deborah isn't talking about scientific findings. She's trying to make biological essentialism work. But we're not done looking at Deborah's cherry picked findings yet. Deborah launches into another defense of James Damore's memo, Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, to claim that, scientifically speaking, Damore's claims that differences in gender behavior are due to prenatal testosterone in the womb is solid. In fact, the "it's all due to prenatal testosterone in the womb" is Deborah's favorite argument.
It all comes down to biology and exposure to testosterone in the womb. So females who may be gender atypical, who are more masculine, again, are more likely on average to be exposed to higher levels of testosterone. Higher levels of exposure to testosterone are associated with more male typical interests. Or they'll just say something like prenatal testosterone, ha ha ha, that doesn't exist. And I'm thinking, there are thousands of studies backing up the fact that prenatal testosterone influences gender and gendered behavior.
Now, with the amount of times that Deborah has said prenatal testosterone exposure affects behavior, like it's the holy grail of arguments, and to the extent it is discussed across the chapters in the book, you'd think that the scientific evidence of prenatal testosterone exposure impacting behavior would be some of the most powerful, robust, consistent effects in science. But it's not. And again, we see Deborah cherry picking data to fit her worldview. Deborah cites a 2006 review by Melissa Hines to speculate as to why gender nonconforming women would show higher levels of prenatal testosterone. But if you actually read the review and look at how Hines discusses the evidence for variation in prenatal testosterone to affect behavior, you'll see prenatal testosterone is weakly and inconsistently associated with postnatal behaviors. Hines does note a couple well powered studies that have found effects, but these studies have showed weak effects of prenatal testosterone, with Hines' own prior work showing that maternal testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin levels don't differ between boys and girls, and again, only relatively weak effects of testosterone on gendered behavior in women. Using other longitudinal data, Hines again observed an effect, but you can see the relatively weak effect size and percent of variance accounted for. Further, within that same review, Hines notes prior studies that haven't found relationships between testosterone and gendered behavior at all. You can say, oh, that study's based on a small sample size, but you'd expect such a robust and influential effect to be observed at least somewhat in these less well powered studies. But to be fair to Deborah, that's a review from 2006, so maybe things have changed. Well, no. Another 2015 review by Hines still notes the inconsistencies across the work of prenatal testosterone on behavior. So again, I'm not sure why Deborah thinks Damore's claims are solid, or why she thinks prenatal testosterone is some slam dunk for each of her arguments. Maybe it's because Damore has autism. I don't know why that's relevant, but Deborah certainly thought it was. Even at the end of the chapter, Deborah seems to be aware of how fallacious her arguments sound because she notes that she's just talking about averages and these don't apply to individuals.
On average, there are differences between what you would find typically in men and typically in women. So that doesn't say anything about any individual person. So that's one important point.
And yet, throughout the book, she wants to apply these averages as if they are clear groups that people belong to. She'll continually refer to these as sex differences, as essential differences between men and women that necessarily distinguish an individual man from an individual woman. But all of the evidence that Deborah has brought to the table doesn't show that. And the evidence against her position that she poorly tried to dismiss shows the opposite, that there's no such thing as a singular female brain or a male brain, but wild variation among individuals, that the concentrations of a single hormone don't make you intrinsically suited to one set of behaviors for your entire life. The only thing Deborah manages to demonstrate in presenting her own evidence is that even when she has all of this space to make her case, the only thing she can do is twist a small set of highly selective findings to fit her worldview. That worldview is, of course, that all of sex and gender is binary, and in Chapter 3, Deborah states outright that there are only two genders. The claim is made devoid of any real facts, so I don't know why this chapter needs 30 pages. Then again, I don't know why this book needs to exist, but here we are. The majority of the early chapter has the feel of your technologically inept mother trying to explain that newfangled computer program called Word she heard about to you, where Deborah recounts all of the new words related to gender she's heard about, from demisexual to genderqueer to non-binary. Deborah also thinks she has some amazing gotcha by pointing out the term non-binary might imply there's a binary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's still based on a binary model essentially, because you're still referring to it one of or two things, which shows, I think, the lack of logic that goes behind the movement.
It would be a shame, though, if someone pointed out to Deborah that intersex, which she brought up before, implies that there are actually more than two sexes. But we'll let Deborah ignore that contradiction and also let her ignore how language is used to convey ideas to people, such as, I don't identify within your prescribed gender binary. I don't really know why Deborah takes guesses as to what she thinks people mean when they use these words or why people use them, because you'd think that, as a journalist, she could have done, an interview and figured it out. But there are no interviews, no personal accounts of what people using these words mean in her book, which is odd because she's going to include interviews with people who support her later on. The only real attempts at evidence Deborah makes in this chapter is to argue about third gender cultures, focusing her attention on the Guaidoses of the Dominican Republic. These are individuals who are born with XY chromosomes but present in childhood with a highly feminized appearance and are often raised as girls until their sex characteristics become much more prominent during puberty. The reason for this is genetic variability leading to lower production of an enzyme involved in processing testosterone. Deborah, and to be fair, the BBC as well, refer to this as a deficiency of the protein, but deficiency is a relativist term implying that it should be one way or the other, when in actuality, there's nothing biologically wrong with these individuals. They just develop differently and as a result are treated differently. Calling it a deviation implies there is something wrong, that there's some deviant from what it should be, when this is really just an example of how variable sex biology can be. This doesn't matter to Deborah because to her, it still doesn't prove that there are more than two genders because testosterone or something, and instead further goes on to prove that socialization doesn't impact gender, while simultaneously noting that some Guavidoses will choose to remain women, thereby acknowledging the social influences on gender which she just claimed don't exist. The rest of the chapter is largely composed of Deborah concern trolling non binary people, opining that these individuals are doing harm to people who are really trans by making a mockery of gender dysphoria, saying non binary or genderqueer people are just confused youths, and strongly implying that these individuals aren't really non binary but have other mental health problems leading them to act out.
I was going to say with non-binary, so this is the thing, and it blows my mind that this is considered hateful, or that even to say that non-binary, people who identify as non-binary are in any way different from people who are trans, who've transitioned to the opposite sex within a binary framework.
How many of these people are legitimately trans? How many of these people are legitimately dealing with like a real mental issue that's causing them to shift from male to female and back again?
So say with someone with a personality disorder, and people like a lot of attention, they like to, it's always about them and their identity shifts a lot. So this could very well be what it is, and now they're being basically rewarded for that.
I don't think what they're experiencing, I think for many of them, maybe they are legitimately suffering and maybe they have issues with their gender, but it's not true gender dysphoria like you're saying. I think sometimes it's other psychopathology.
You are welcome to say I'm misrepresenting you, Deborah, but when someone says there's just a conversation we're not having regarding non binary people, and then run in to talk about autism and other mental health disorders, it's pretty heavily implied where you're going. And no, the definition of gender dysphoria does not imply there are differently sexed brains or imply a binary. You don't get to say there are only average differences and that you're not making claims to individuals and then do just that in your later chapters. Chapter 3 for me really solidified that Deborah doesn't read any sources because she goes on a little rant about how traditional gender roles aren't necessarily bad, noting that masculine and feminine are not in the DSM. By the way, neither are hate crimes, but not being in the DSM doesn't then make them good. She then says toxic masculinity isn't a thing, and masculine norms are not necessarily psychologically damaging, citing a prior meta analysis to make that point. But if you read the meta analysis, you find that adherence to masculine norms results in less psychological help seeking, which is part of what people are talking about when they discuss toxic masculinity. All of this provides a broad level overview of some of the major issues within the first section of Deborah's book. The foundation, where Deborah was laying the groundwork for her entire book, her chance to lay out all of the irrefutable evidence of her positions. Instead, Deborah flat out fails to debunk any of the supposed myths she laid out in this section. Her entire strategy seemed to be to just make authoritative statements for people who implicitly agree with her, with a startling lack of any real evidence to convince people of her position. When she does try to provide evidence, it's easy to demonstrate that she can only cherry pick findings and produce unsupportive tidbits of data. Rather than show the veracity of her positions, the only thing her citation suggests is that she's not nearly as familiar with the literature as she'd have you believe. As I said, I've left out quite a bit of the first few chapters to try and focus on some of the major points, much of what I've left out being her inane, ideologically driven ramblings against progressives and liberals, her personal anecdotes, and her recycling of conservative talking points. But if you found yourself annoyed by the clear scientific illiteracy or the inconsistent arguments Deborah put forward so far, then you are in for a treat as we fly off from the foundations that Deborah has set and move into the frontier of the gender wars.
So, say with someone with a personality disorder, and people like a lot of attention, they like to, it's always about them and their identity shifts a lot. So, this could very well be what it is, and now they're being basically rewarded for that.